Welcome to the If You Could See Me podcast. Thank you for joining the movement. I'm your host, Erin Mahone. I'm an author, storyteller, facilitator, and mental health professional. I like to talk about big things, ask difficult questions, and challenge the ways in which we perceive ourselves, one another, and what's possible in the world. On this podcast, I speak to thinkers, makers, feelers, and folks fighting for change. You'll experience entertaining, thought-provoking conversations with people from all walks of life. I believe that mental health is health, and it goes so far beyond conversations about illness, medications, and treatment. Our mental health is essential to living our best lives, and I want to live in a world in which we talk about emotional wellness as easily and frequently as talking about the common cold. We aren't there yet, but I believe we can be. When I set out to create this thing, I had no idea what I was doing. Just that I wanted to share my story and I hoped I wasn't alone. I've discovered that so many people need to find solidarity. They need to know they aren't alone. Well, I'm here to tell you, you are not alone. We can have these difficult conversations in the light of day. We can laugh, joke, and get serious about making change. I've tried to create multiple entry points within this movement, and I hope you will take some time to check out all of our resources and consider sharing your story on our website, ifyoucouldseeme.com. There you can submit your story, find mental health resources, submit ideas or resources yourself, read the stories of other brave warriors, find out about future live events, and invite me to speak or give a workshop in your area. If you're inspired by what we're doing, I hope you'll consider helping out by visiting our Patreon page, patreon.com/ifyoucouldseeme, purchasing my book, rating and reviewing this podcast on iTunes to help people find us, or just send me a message to let me know how this project is impacting you, ways we can improve, and future podcast or blog topics. This was only an idea until amazing people like you joined me in bringing it to life. Enjoy the show. You may have noticed that this interview ended fairly abruptly. I had a minor technical difficulty, and as a result, the last minute or so of our conversation got cut off. So I scheduled a time to add, that last minute to our conversation, and in true Rob and Erin fashion, we ended up talking the second time for about an hour. So what I decided to do was release this as a two-part interview. I think that Rob is one of the most inspiring people that I have ever met. He is brilliant. He thinks about things differently. He sees the world differently. And I think so many people can benefit from his perspective. So keep an eye out for the second episode of the ReStory interview. And in the meantime, check out his new podcast, the Cerebral podcast. The information is in the show notes for you to check that out. Please connect with If You Could See Me on Facebook and Instagram. Check us out online at www.ifyoucouldseeme.com. Share your story, write it, speak it. Connect with us in whatever ways you feel most comfortable and called to do, and join the movement. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you guys very soon. All right. Hello, friends and family, and welcome to yet another episode of the If You Could See Me podcast. My name is Erin Mahone. I am so happy to have you here with me on the new journey as a member of the Mental Health News Radio Network. I am joined today by a very dear friend who has been so patient with me in the the scheduling of this podcast, my dear friend, RgTargos. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome, and congratulations on the Mental Health Network.
Thank you. Rob is more things than I can put into one introduction. However, what comes to mind first is he is an incredible advocate and self-advocate. He is a language lover and a wordsmith, which we will get into in just a few minutes. He's a creative person. He is a quality control manager, but he also says he's a QC manager, and we're going to get into a little bit more about what that means, and in particular, Rob's love of stretching the English language and seeing what's possible. So, Rob, before we get started, why don't you just tell the audience a little bit about you, maybe the top one thing you want everybody to know about you today.
The version of myself is not what I would have thought about, but knowing who I am now and being who I am today, I wouldn't have done it any other way, because this version of myself is based on everything from circumstances to timing, other things that happened that I didn't necessarily have control over, and so, but this is the best version of myself today.
I love it. I am, so Rob and I met as part of the Real Abilities Film Festival almost 4 years ago now, here in Richmond. And it was sort of like fast friendship. It was, he walked into our space and it was like, okay, we're friends now. Here we are. So what was it, at the Strange Ways Brewery?
It was. One of the strangest ways that I met someone.
Once again, there's the language. And then, so you had very recently moved to town and you didn't know anybody, and you saw this thing in the paper or wherever, and you just showed up. What makes you the kind of person that just sees something in the paper, doesn't know anybody, and just shows up?
Well, the way I found out about it was through the Down syndrome,
okay.
And they had sent an email, and I had asked them just about what things were they aware of as far as any arts and entertainment stuff. They didn't really know it. They have a lot of connections, obviously, in Richmond, and they're one of the most inclusive organizations, even though they focus on Down syndrome and other, but they're the ones that actually recommended me and told me about this after receiving an email. I think it was from Missy or someone within the JCC, and then I just said, I don't know anyone. I can, if I go, I have the possibility of meeting someone. If nothing else, I can meet new people, and if nothing happens, I'm no worse for wear. And so that's what it was. But you have been one of my best influences over the last 4 years, and along with the JCC, I really do think that the Virginia version of myself, it would have been different if I would have stayed in New Jersey, but the Virginia version of myself is what it is, and it just has its own components to it.
So, before we started recording, we were talking about, the idea of being a sort of flexible person, being adaptable, and so I'm curious to know, that's an interesting statement that you just made, that the Virginia version of yourself is different than the New Jersey version of yourself. And while there are obvious reasons for that, I think many people like to think that they are who they are, and they will be relatively the same no matter what situation they find themselves in. It's not many of us who realize or who allow ourselves to be that open to becoming a different me or Rob or whomever. Mm-hmm. So talk to me about what you have some very specific life experiences. What were you born that way? Were you born this adaptable guy that just sort of, is open to the universe, or have you had to learn that skill?
Well, most recently I learned it thanks to Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, because I saw that movie yesterday.
You did?
And it was great. And but to approach your question more seriously, my situation when I was born in 1972 was I needed to adjust to the world. I didn't have any real choice. Mm-hmm. The ADA obviously wouldn't come around for another 20 or 25 years. Mm-hmm. And so I always had to adapt to the things that were around me.
Mm-hmm. And so to clarify, just for people who are listening who may not know you, you have cerebral palsy, and that was something that you were born with and that you have had to, learn to, live with and adjust to your entire life.
Right. And I was born 2 months prematurely, and my parents didn't know what to do, and they were like, okay, well, and I think they thought they would figure it out, but at the same time, they had very limited knowledge and tools to how to raise someone with a disability, which in a way forced me in a positive way to find my own way. Everything from going to school and going up and down the stairs. My parents, for example, didn't buy a house that was a one level. I always had to go upstairs, but when I was in my first operation was in 1978, and I was in a full body cast for 3 months, and then in rehab for another 3 to 6 months after that.
Wow.
And
you were 6 years old.
And I was around 4.5.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that's where I think that's where my creative and playful way of talking and speaking and thinking came from, because I had to entertain myself and figure out different ways of coping emotionally, and because things that I tried to communicate with friends or family, they could understand to a certain point, but because I was the one going through it, that they really couldn't understand it to that degree. But then again, I couldn't understand what my parents went through having, and from their perspective. So that's another thing that I learned very early on, is you could change your perspective very quickly, even in the same situation. Just by taking a different viewpoint of it, or just by changing your position, either physically or emotionally, historically, in so many different ways. And going to school, I should back up. The other early opportunity that really shaped my life is I got the opportunity to be on Sesame Street.
Right.
And I got that opportunity because of my disability, and the person that played Big Bird, his brother actually had cerebral palsy, and so he was a big proponent, which I didn't find out until about 30 years later.
Wow.
But you know as well as I do that Sesame Street and Children's Self-Interest Workshop was always very ahead of its time and tried to include people. And now they do things with autism, mental health, other things. Right. And so to me, it was, I got this opportunity because of my disability, but I also had certain limitations because of my disability, and there was a misunderstanding, and so I had to redefine and reinterpret what I was going through and how I would handle certain things. And it continued from when I was in school and met with the principal and the teachers, and they said, "We'll let you come here, but if you fall, you cannot sue the school. You cannot because we're giving you the opportunity to be here, and we'll help you as much as we can, but we don't." They wanted to limit their liability, which at that time I understood, and my parents understood, because of the opportunity that I was given.
So in another circumstance, you would have gone to a different school. You would have gone to a school specifically designed to meet the needs of children with disabilities.
My parents didn't want that.
Right.
And they were given the...
But this was before inclusion. This was before inclusion, quote unquote, mainstreaming and all of that.
This was when mainstreaming and 504 and different things from Vietnam, and without Vietnam, I don't think the disability movement would be where it is, because, and I was trying to tell people that Vietnam is a situation where we didn't expect what happened, but because people were drafted, and the choices that they had, that they just had to adjust to whatever the choices. So by law, because of the draft, the government had to agree to allow for certain inclusive people that when they came back from Vietnam. So,
I was not aware of that. That's fascinating.
It's one of the unknown things about the disability movement in the 1960s and 70s. Because it was, and if it would have been just enlistment, then because people were, it wasn't a choice. And my dad was even in Vietnam for about 6 months.
Really?
And he wasn't on the front lines, but he was more in strategy and planning. But it also impacted him a lot too.
Right. So you were given the opportunity to go to a school, but they basically said, we're doing you a favor. Don't sue us if you fall down as a result of your disability. So, I mean, it sounds to me like you were a small child, but, how does that feel? Did you hear that? Did you know that was what was... I
knew but I also knew that was the way it was, and really that was the best choice. And that goes back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, where the choice that you have isn't necessarily what you want, but it's just based on circumstances or different things that are happening at the time. That, yes, if things were different, if there was more money, if there was more understanding, if there wasn't custodians who mopped the floor 5 minutes before I got into school, and I fell multiple times and then I had to go to the principal and say, you can't clean the school 5 minutes before the bell starts.
Right.
And they had to adjust the custodial schedule for me because of that.
So that brings up a kind of my next question, which is, did you always find yourself in a position where you were having to be a self-advocate, where you were having to say, this is what I need? Or is that something that came, over time?
Knowing what I needed and knowing what I wanted was something that I always had, but it wasn't something I was able to articulate.
Right.
There was a lot of there's a lot of anxiety in my family and other issues, like we talked about before, prior to the podcast. But so the anxiety that my family had and my parents had, it was then thrust on me on top of my disability, or along with my disability, where people who had more supportive parents, or who understood disability and the structure of institutions, and how that I was able to use my anxiety more and focus my anxiety more, but I wasn't able to communicate well, because
you were a child.
Because I wasn't.
Because we, as children, we count on the adults in our lives to advocate for us or help us learn how to do that.
And then, with my crutches, because I use forearm crutches that I use to now navigate my world, but I always haven't felt that way, where my crutches were an extension of me.
Right.
And the way that I explain it to people is, my crutches, when people see them, they see it as a sign of my disability. I used to see it that way too, and they also didn't know about my anxiety, my dyslexia, other things that weren't even behind that, and so that it became more of a battle with myself sometimes to know what was possible and dealing with different circumstances. What that taught me was how to use my environment more, looking around at chairs, looking around at people, looking around and finding out how or what I could do to help myself. Everything from turning off the light with my crutch, and using it literally as an extension, and also mentally using my crutches as something where I can't stand because I'm tired, so I'll just lean on my crutches. So leaning on my disability and leaning in too also became an important part of it as well.
And so talk a little bit about now how because I've heard you talk about this before, and talk about what the crutches now represent to you, like in that language.
The crutches represent to me the tools that I use to navigate the world, and I always haven't treated them as an extension, and they always have been seen as an extension of myself, but they are an extension of myself, just like with someone who came back from Iraq and they lost an arm, or so it's that way of the interpretation of it, and that can be for people in wheelchairs and other. In the 4 surgeries that I've been through, I've been in a wheelchair pretty much to a year and a half. So I do have that experience. But going back and to what we talked about before, about thinking how I was, I can remember from an early age, probably when I was 3 years old, falling and people either looking or saying things, and because I was in a stroller and I wasn't big enough to be in a wheelchair. I can remember how people were saying certain things that I was too big for the stroller, and for whatever reason that really stuck with me. And one of the things that I was determined to do was I wanted to get out of the stroller, and so when I got the opportunity to go through the surgery and be on crutches, learning on crutches, it was a long process of learning how to use them both physically and emotionally, and
right. I think that's part of my question. I don't mean to interrupt you,
mm-hmm.
but I love that you just said that. How to use them physically and emotionally, because there is, I would imagine, a certain amount of emotional use that you have to understand.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it does expand your the world's accessibility to you,
mm-hmm.
but at the same time, there's still a certain amount of, people are looking, people can see,
mm-hmm.
people are, and when you're a child and you're trying to learn how to navigate the world, and the last thing you want to do is stand out,
right.
there's an emotional piece to that.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to hear a little bit more about sort of the messages that you told yourself. It sounds to me like you have always been your biggest sort of advocate, and just, you have this incredible strength inside yourself to be able to reframe things. So
yeah, and it's always been there, but it's not always. It's been inward more than outward.
Right.
And over the last 4 years, thanks to you and thanks to other people at the JCC, at the Down syndrome, and just the different support systems that I have here, everything from friends to they've even brought out some of the things that I've always struggled with, and you probably laugh at this, but or find this ironic that I've always had trouble making friends, and one of the things that is always in the back of my head is, did I share too much? Did I show too much? Did I say too much? Did I fall too? Like, what did I do that? Because growing up, I lost a lot of friends in the disability community and in just my different social circles, because at a certain point it became too much for people to handle, or the dynamic as far as, where peer pressure became too much into it. And one of the things that I'm thinking about now in my head is, I don't know if you remember the show Rescue 911.
Yeah.
With William Shatner.
Yep.
So I was a senior in high school watching, and they had a story about someone who was in a car accident, and he was a senior in high school like me, and then after this car accident, they were talking about him going to the senior prom, mm-hmm. and even to the his girlfriend and other people in his family, they're like, of course he's got us, he's got other things that he can rely on to help him, and we want him. And I just remember that being one of the lowest points of my life, because I had that, I'm sure I had that, but I didn't feel it emotionally where people could really understand. I grew up in a very competitive school, and so I had friends and teachers that always didn't understand what the situations were and how to navigate them. One of the examples that I talk about is the only time that I got some accommodation for testing in high school was when my papers got torn up. And what the situation was is that I would get 3 or 4 minutes extra time, mm-hmm. to finish the test Well, there would be, and this happened 4 or 5 times in my junior and senior year, where people that were leaving the class, they would take my test off my desk, rip up my test because they didn't like the fact that I was getting
Extra
2 or
time.
3 more minutes of extra time because I couldn't. They didn't want to do, and they didn't want to do it in a free period or do other things. Eventually, that became an option, but when
Right.
I first started in school and in high school, so that was really the only time that I had accommodation is when all the other options went out the window.
Right.
And so
And so you came from a place where vulnerability was seen as weakness.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think you and I collectively, along with lots of other people, but with all of our different projects, we are trying to create this world in which that we know is true, which is vulnerability is strength. And so it sounds to me like it is unbelievable to me to hear you say that you've ever had a hard time making friends, because you're one of the most personable people I've ever met. You are, from the first time we met, it was like, fast friendship. I can't imagine that you haven't always been that person. But it does sort of take me back to that thing you said in the beginning, where the Virginia version of Rob is different than, maybe the New Jersey version was or would have been. And so what was the turning point for you to decide to, or are you continuing to decide to become this person who sort of honors that vulnerability and who worries less about did you share too much, or are you still doing that and just pushing through it anyway?
I'm still doing it and still learning, and but I just have more confidence and more support, not only for myself, but my belief systems have evolved over time.
And talk to me more about that. How have your belief systems evolved?
Well, with my crutches, as I said before, they were always seen as weakness rather than tools. And if more people can see not necessarily the disability, but how crutches or a wheelchair or even medication for it can be used as a coping and a management tool. So that's really what I try to push forward is the quality control part of managing a disability. And
so you said before we started, the QC can also stand for other things, and I kind of want to use this as an opportunity to transition into the thing that one of the things I love most about you, which is your the way that you use language. And so you said QC also could stand for quality curiosity. And so I think your connection to the wordsmithing and then also your curiosity, those are two things that are kind of synonymous about you. Talk to me about curiosity, and 2, about what your specific sort of dual meanings about a lot of words. Where does that come from? How does that play into your life? And just sort of share that, because it's so fun, and you pick things. You are so perceptive about the world and about people and about situations, and you just always teach me so many things. So, go.
Well, it started really with Sesame Street.
Okay.
Because then I started thinking, well, open Sesame Street, because that opened up a whole. If I hadn't been part of Sesame Street. So even something as simple as opening Sesame Street and quality control is also quality curiosity, quality comfort, and because quality comfort and I even talk about this in my job, where quality comfort has to come first before people are comfortable with taking certain actions. And they're not comfortable with it. Will they become comfortable? You don't know, but you can support the environment of how to do that. And I work for a social emotional learning company. That's what, and so a lot of the things that I think about and with making up words or different meanings was a way to redefine who I was, what my circumstances were, and because that was the way that I could reversion myself in, and also it makes sense to people, and everything from the Karate Kid and The Mighty, which is a movie that you know as well, and other disability movies like My Left Foot, I say my left foot, my right brain, and it's all about finding a way that might not exist or you might not have thought about before, and how to. But one of the regarding the language and how I think and philosophize about. So when I went to school up in Marist College, which is Poughkeepsie, and the first A that I got was in philosophy. And the first things that I learned about was René Descartes and John Locke, about innate ideas and about building experience. And those two types of ways of looking at the world. And most recently, I've gotten into Glennon Doyle, who talks about a third alternative or other using language, and one of her words is brutiful.
Yes.
And so it's just a way of redefining or defining for yourself what works. And that's where it came from, because a path didn't necessarily exist for me, so I had to create one. And so that's again where the creative part came out of it. And I that I write poetry, and I wrote a poem once called Staircase, which isn't about an actual staircase, but more importantly, it's also about the staircase of being looked at. And so the version and experience that I had was somewhat different, but it could also be connected back to how I could learn and teach people.
So I feel like we're like simpatico, because you keep going exactly where I am. My next sort of question is.
We've known each other for 4 years.
For long enough, and we are enough alike, I think. So I am curious. I know that in my life, as the person that I am, who is very similar in that sort of, fear of my innate direction is always to go deep and to go, let's just, become the oversharers of the world. And I always walk away from interactions, not as much now, but, historically in my life, walk away from interactions thinking, oh my God, what did I just do? Why did I go all those places? And, so I think that I have spent a lot of my life trying to work really hard to make people uncomfortable with who I am. And my, quote unquote disabilities are invisible. Nobody can see my depression. Nobody can see my anxiety unless I share it with them. you have a different experience. And I'm curious to know how much of your life you've spent feeling responsible for making other people comfortable.
I think that for a large part of my life, my job was to adjust to other people,
right,
and not really because there's always the risk of losing an opportunity or losing a connection, right, because of the choices that you make. And it's not until recently, over the last year or so, where, and I think part of this is not only where I am in my life, but also the different choices that I have, in that I don't need to adapt to everyone. I can just make my choices and be communicative about it. And I think it talks more about friendship when you're communicative, and even though you don't like something or someone or even someone that you get along with or you disagree with, but as long as you're open and communicative about it, that to me is more important to friendship, because you don't necessarily have to like your friends or what they do, but to me you have a responsibility to be open and communicate to, and then they will make the adjustment. Right. It's one of the things that I learned from you. It's one of the things that I learned from the JCC. It's one of the things that, but there is still, and I don't know where this comes from, but I sort of do, but it comes from the bullying and the emotional toll of having to push through and deal with different circumstances where it did I go too far? Did I not do this right? And one of the things that I've come to peace with recently is the reality is that this happened. If someone doesn't like it, or or if the situation changes, or different things occurred, and that's how I can only manage how I am. I can't necessarily manage how I can help people to understand what they can do, or how they can be, but if they're uncomfortable with what I'm going through, or even talking about. I mean, my parents get upset that I talk about my stroke that I had when I was born, which they didn't tell me about. But to them, it was a situation where the more they kept it from me, the more I could push myself. The negative part of that was everything that I did when I was growing up, from falling to making a mistake to stuttering, and it was my fault. It was my fault. You didn't understand why it was happening. It wasn't attributed to, he's got 20 to 25% brain damage, right, because he was born prematurely, and he also had a stroke when he was born. And so, and I understand why my parents did what they did, and I think that's an important piece of it, right, is understand. But just because I understand it doesn't mean that I won't talk about it and be open about it. And one of the thing that really saved my life outside of creativity, art, and are things like Lou Ferrigno and the Incredible Hulk, and Facts of Life, Baywatch, Nickelodeon, all these things that I've been involved with, but
talk about how you were involved in those things, please. Because I know, but they don't.
So with Baywatch, I got the opportunity when I was in college. I was a big Baywatch fan because of, obviously there was the visual aspect of it, but
you're so diplomatic, Rob.
which is appealing,
of course.
But also there was something about the show, even from the early episodes, that where they were dealing with disabilities, even when it was on NBC. And then when I was in college, I actually read a Playboy profile of one of the stars of the show, Erica Leniak, and she actually was dating someone at the time who was paraplegic, and that was the first time. That was the first time when I was like, wait, someone can actually date someone with a disability, and
wow.
It wasn't about the other stuff that was revealed but that to me
just opened up a whole new world of possibilities.
And it was at a time when I was in college, and I found out about it in freshman year, and then started writing fan letters to the producers of the show, and when it went into syndication, they had more direct involvement and input, and they actually did a lot of stuff with fans. They, as a result of one of the fan letters that I sent, soon after that, they announced the contest, and I said, well, I did Sesame Street, so I can use that as a, but I also came up with an idea halfway through college to incorporate disabilities and the beach and Baywatch, and so that's how it started. And I actually wrote a 20-page spec script over the summer of my sophomore year, and submitted it. And the thing that really I really did to distinguish is I sent the letter with a return receipt. So the person that I was addressed to, one of the producers, actually had to receive it. Whether or not he responded, well, 3 days later, he called me up and we had a half-hour conversation, and writing the script, even though it wasn't accepted, and they liked parts of it, and it was very cathartic for me to again, it goes back to using creativity to learn and grow, for not only for other people but also for yourself.
Right.
And so, and then when I after college, my first job was with Nickelodeon, and 2 years after that, Nickelodeon and MTV did a combined episode with Baywatch, and I actually through some other connections and doing other things, I got the opportunity to visit the set and met all the producers over a 2-year period. So that's a short version of it.
That's so cool. That is such a cool story. I think that so much of what you I don't want to talk to Rob just about Rob as a person with CP, even though that is a part of who you are. That is not all of who you are. And you go through this life with this wide open, at least the Rob that I know, the Virginia Rob that I know, you go through the world with this very wide open sort of appreciation for all of your experiences and the people that you come in contact with. One of the I told you before we started that I had 3 words that I sort of wrote down to describe you, although there are hundreds. And I'm not creative with my words; they're just actual regular words. I didn't, smash anything together or anything. But one of the things that I admire so much about you is the gratitude that you sort of walk through life with. Yes, you're determined, which we've already talked about. Determination and creativity are the others, but you have so much gratitude for the people in your life and the experiences that you've had, and how you've gotten, but you are your own best champion. You just show up to the world and you use the tools that you have to get where you want to go. And so I want to hear about where does this gratitude come from? How do you, how does it happen? How does Rob become Rob?
Well, the gratitude comes from the fact that there is a lot of things that I wouldn't and I don't have the ability to do, but there are also friends that I have and people that I've known that don't have the same abilities that I do, either to speak, to walk, or to do other things, and even who are no longer with us. And I also carry those people with me, and that also sometimes causes a clash between family, friends, and where my family doesn't understand the depths that I need to go to change perceptions, and they don't want me to take the risks. But it's more about knowing that what I have is also a gift. And you mentioned about things smashing into each other and the creativity. It reminds me of something else where it must have been when I was 11 years old, and we were putting up some lights on the Christmas tree, and I just had two bulbs in my hand, and I literally had one bulb in each hand, and I was like, I wonder what and I literally just bumped them up and smashed them up, and I just wanted to figure out how, what would happen. And when that happened, my parents were like, well, what did you think would happen?
I don't know. That's the point.
So
did they break?
They did. One of them broke, and it's like, of course it was going to break.
But you never know until you try. I have a kid like that.
And
I try to appreciate it. I really do.
And that's where a lot of the situations that I come in with my job. That's one of the ways that I try to look at things. Where how can I smash two things together and make something different? That's one of the reasons why I like oxymorons, because an oxymoron is two different things. But put those two things together, whether it be Baywatch, whether it be Sesame Street, whether it be cerebral palsy, that's one of the other oxymorons, and probably the best oxymoron that I have is using the cerebral against the palsy. And so it's having some of that experience to jump off of, and also realizing that my life is not about me. And I learned that from a very early age, being bullied and treated and not being treated well. What was my only choice? With the hope that people would learn from my example. Whether and there are plenty of examples in history about that, with Martin Luther King and Jackie Robinson and other people. I can get religious on you, but I won't.
You can, please. That's what you want. That's all good.
And well, the other thing that I was thinking about was we've had this whole conversation, and one of the cornerstones that with the JCC is the power of struggle, and there is power in struggle. And when I heard that on the page with Doc Gibbs in our town,
which was the play for everybody else, one of the first projects that Rob and I worked on together, other than the Real Abilities Film Festival, was the Kesem Inclusive Theater Project at the Jewish Community Center here in Richmond, which we continue to participate in together. So please, the first play that we did was an adapted version of Our Town by Oscar Wilde. Yes? Is that Thornton Wilder. Sorry. Oh my gosh. I'm going to get eviscerated for that one. Sorry. You're right. Thank you. Thornton Wilder. I was close.
So, a while, it was wild sometimes.
I knew it was almost right. Sorry. I can't hold it all in my brain. Anyway, please continue. Dot Gibbs.
And just the power of struggle.
Right.
And that to me shattered my world as far as what could be possible, and how to learn from how to grow from struggle. Mm-hmm. Because people, even in my experience, I have friends and family who want to go away from struggle and not deal with it and avoid it, and I'm like, well, you can avoid it, or you can go, but at some points there is no avoiding a situation, so you have to embrace it.
It's really funny. I'm just, I had this page of just random notes, and one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was this sort of human need to, or inclination toward, the resistance of negative experiences, because it's one of the things that I see you really kind of fighting against, is that you are just in the world. Mm-hmm. And many people, no matter what struggle, as you put it, mm-hmm. they are facing, they put themselves in a box, and they don't do new things, and they don't challenge the status quo, and they don't try to become different versions of themselves, ultimately because we are fearful and we don't like rejection, and we don't, but overall we're trying to avoid bad things happening to us. And if I stay in a place where I am comfortable and I know what to expect from a day-to-day point of view, I am most likely to avoid bad things happening in my life. So talk to me about, we said, hey, Rob, come be in this theater show, and you hadn't been on a stage since you were a kid. What made you do that, and then continue to put yourself in these positions of newness and new challenges and adventures?
Well, first of all, you deserve some credit for that, because I resisted for a couple months before you finally convinced me.
I don't remember that at all. I don't remember that, but okay, I'll take a little bit of credit.
But it's just the. That if I wouldn't do it, that it wouldn't be done. And sometimes you don't choose what the circumstances are, mm-hmm. but you have to deal with them. You have to deal with them anyway. Mm-hmm.
So that's like what we were talking about before, is that you show up to a situation and you don't have necessarily all the information, or things may not be exactly as you would want them to be, mm-hmm. but you just show up anyway. And
you also work, if things aren't the way you want them to be, you can work to change either the circumstances or change yourself. Or one of the newest sayings that I have is drills, which is based on dignity and respect, increasing larger living space. And also a drill is a tool, but drill is an activity where if you do something over and over and over and over, you eventually learn and are able to rehabilitate yourself physically, emotionally, or in other ways, mm-hmm. or you listen to other people, or voices in your head of your friends like you and like Doc Gibbs, and right. So you go back to building the environment right. of how you can do that and change. You can't necessarily change the world, but you can change your own environment, your own circumstances. It may not take a couple days, but it could take a year, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years. Where I am now with, I've been in here 5.5 years, and it was drastically different than when I first got here,
right.
and just over time, but like when I went to college, the first experience I had was going to a lecture on having a positive relationship with yourself, with my friend Susie, talking about safe sex and relationships, and her the biggest thing she said to me, and the reason why we're still friends today, is she said the most powerful relationship is not one that you have with another person. It's the relationship you have with yourself. And I was like, whoa, wait, what? Huh? Well,
right.
If I have a relationship with someone else, I don't need a relationship with myself. So, I'm kidding.
But you're kidding. But so many people have relationships with other people, so they don't have to have relationships with themselves.
Right.
So they can avoid that aloneness that we have to have, where we can listen to ourselves, and where we can, you say drills is, something you repeat over and over again. I think about it as that tool that digs deeper and deeper and deeper into whatever thing, and gets to, the core, or the, pushes one thing through to, a depth that it had never gone before, and makes another thing possible.
Right.
And, so that those scary aspects of being a human being are things that we avoid at all costs very often. People get married and divorced over and over and over again, or, date 1,000 different people just so they don't have to be alone with themselves. So for you to have had someone in your life at that early of an age to bring that, that thought process, that's pretty amazing. Gosh, I wish I had heard that message when I was 18.
Yeah.
Would have made my early 20s a lot easier.
But you wouldn't be where you are today.
No, it's true.
In the version that you have.
It's
the
true.
version that you have. And,
thank you for using my words against me. We're nearing the end of our time together, but I want to sort of end with this thing that, again, we were talking about before, and it sort of works into this, and that is the concept of reasonable action versus reasonable accommodation, and the idea that, what is our personal individual responsibility to creating the life that we want to have, whatever our needs may be. And just sort of your point of view on that, and how you're working in this world to make it what you need it to be, not just as an individual with a disability, but as a human, who wants to connect with people and have emotional, interactions, and doesn't want to be afraid that they've shared too much, and doesn't want to see their vulnerability as a weakness, but as a strength.
Well, it comes back to rehabilitation and going through the 4 surgeries that I did, and having to change and version and rehabilitate myself physically, emotionally, and in other ways. I think about process in multiple ways. Process is a sequence of actions. Process is also a noun, which is building towards something, and you can use process in other respects as well. But it's one simple way of what process can I use not to be successful, but how can I repeatedly change and adapt so that I get better. Because process, to me, is one of the cornerstones of success. Whether it's how do I successfully get up in the morning and take a shower, to how and that goes back to drills. But if you then start with simple processes and then talk about evolving into more complicated processes, but it's something that you control over time. You can build on something, and then it become a process. It becomes something outside of yourself, and that's really what I want the podcast that I'm starting to talk about, is some of the things with vulnerability. And because I think one of the drawbacks of vulnerability in the way that Bryn Brown talked about it was talking about the first thing that people see. Well, the first thing that people see when they see me is my disability, and so I need to talk about that. There's no choice but I can talk about it in such a way where it's more cerebral, and there are ways that you can change your beliefs about yourself and about other people. One of the basic beliefs that I have is the more faith I have in God, the more faith He has in me. And a lot of I think broken processes or broken loops come from the fact that people don't necessarily know how to close certain loops or certain processes so that it then becomes circular and not something that stops or hinders someone.
So when you say that, do you mean that is that's something that a person without a disability doesn't know, or a person with a disability, or everyone? When you're talking specifically about making accommodations or solving issues in the community,
I think it happens with everyone.
Right.
We don't call it reasonable accommodation for people, but how many reasonable accommodations are made do you make for your kids, or do other people make for their family members?
Right.
And it's not about disability, and but it's about how to work productively, and also holding accountability to people and also to yourself, and being honorable about the vulnerability, and I think that's where a lot of people get caught up with the struggle, is they don't want to face the accountability and do it honorably, especially with themselves.
Well, that you really hit on a big thing, and I think that is that's where we have this divergence when it comes to inclusion and diversity. Although those are words that are so widely used right now, but when you talk about the us and them conversation, and is there an us and them, and there really isn't an us and them, but because so often historically we have this sort of power structure that likes to deny its own vulnerability and its own humanity, and say, we are the powerful, we are the people that are in charge, and everyone who is outside of who we are is a them. And we're not going to acknowledge that we could be any number of things that could take our power away, and we have a responsibility to everyone to create a world that everyone can fit inside. So I think it's an interesting sort of internal conflict that happens, that says don't hold us accountable because it's not our job.
And I think one of the things, I don't like goals, because goals, they do change, but goals with certain things that happen, whether it's political or social or with other things, it's not, goals are things that change over time. And processes to me are if there are things you can do on a monthly basis, on a daily basis, where you continually repeat your processes, knowing that they're positive processes, that's where some of the momentum comes from. because whether it's right or wrong, doing the process is always the process.
Well, I love that because it really does turn it into an action, as opposed to a goal is a thing that you get to and then
Right.
it's done.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that we're ever going to get to that day and then the world is going to be fixed and everybody's going to, that's unrealistic,
Mm-hmm.
because we don't know what is going to happen tomorrow. We don't know how things are going to constantly change. But if you talk about a process, I'm now processing what you've said out loud. It is constantly moving. Therefore, it can be constantly evolving. Mm-hmm. It can be self-referential, and in that a process can continue to look at itself,
mm-hmm.
and or whomever is putting it in place. And that just makes so much sense. So anyway, please continue. I'm sorry.
But it's also I know it's great. I appreciate that you quoted me back to me.
I love it. Yes, that's what I do.
But it's the fact that the loop is a positive loop as opposed to a negative or broken loop.
Right.
And I think that's where it goes back to belief systems, where even in Virginia in the 1940s and 30s, the feeble-minded institutions that people with disabilities were a part of, and going back to World War II, it's about the processes or what structures are in place, and it's also about how people approach these, but they don't necessarily change them, and
right.
how the system works because it works for certain people,
right.
or it doesn't work. But you can also have situations where people deny it, whether it's Trump denying certain things, and I'm not going to get political.
It's okay.
But or it goes back to things like the Holocaust denial movement,
right.
and where in order to save the process or the institution or even belief systems, things change, and that way people aren't accountable to themselves or to and that's where the reasonable action and reasonable accommodation comes from, because there are certain things that people with disabilities or family members can do to help increase the independence and not enable the independence. There are also, I've had situations in my life, even in Virginia, of people's friends say to me with disabilities, I wish I could be on crutches rather than being in a wheelchair. And I said, well, if you want, you can push it, but it's how much do you want it, and how much effort do you want to put toward it? And it's not about how much you should do, how much you shouldn't do.
Right.
It's about how much you want to do. And the example that I use for myself is I have friends that drive with disabilities, and they're in wheelchairs, but I don't drive.
Uh-huh.
But for me, the issue with driving, walking with a disability and crutches is actually counterintuitive to driving. Mm-hmm. Or I used to think that way. Whether or not that's still the case, I don't know. But because there were a couple of times where I got into a couple of accidents, mm-hmm. because my body was triggered in a certain way to react as I was walking, even though I was driving. Uh-huh. And so there are certain levels of independence that are okay for certain people, or because you're in a wheelchair and you can drive, or that's whatever works for you. Mm-hmm. It's more about making working to make your world work for you.
Right.
And rather than trying to do what other people
think you
want
should
you
do
to do
or want you to do. Right. Well, I think we can all, understand that to a certain degree. Many of us, most people go through life, certainly not in as, an obvious or clear way as that, to you and your daily experience, but the idea that we are supposed to live up to certain people's expectations or make choices based upon what people think we should be doing. And so many of us, struggle against that, especially those of us who, sort of live outside of the norms of, what people do on a day-to-day basis, and what we try to, as creative people, what we try to focus on and make the world think differently and have conversations that people may not be comfortable with. The big mantra that I feel like I say all the time now, but that sort of has grown out of this movement or whatever it is that we're building is it's not my job to stay quiet so you can stay comfortable. That, we all have our story, we all have our experiences, and I have as much right to, you have as much right to your story and your experience. And that's why when you said the thing that will stick with me probably the most about today is, have I shared too much? Did I cross that line? Did I show too much of myself? Because I think that we have ultimately grown up. You and I are relatively close in age, and we have grown up in a world that made us question that. And made us worry about being too revealing of ourselves and our insecurities and I think that one of the things that you and I are working toward is a world in which we don't have to worry about that anymore.
And it goes back to things like conditional compliance and institutional behavior, where I'll promise you this, or this is expected, so that you, and it even goes to some of the Me Too movement and other things, where in order to get this, you've got to
go through a certain amount of yuckiness, and you have to sacrifice a certain amount of yourself and your own dignity and humanity in order to be welcomed into the promised land, as it were. And that's what we're trying to, to kind of fight against. And
I hadn't thought about it that way, but I love it.
Well, it's kind of, right? It's you gotta give up a little bit of, of your dignity in order to be welcomed in. And there is such a double standard with regard to certain people being asked and expected to give up more than others. Right. And so that's kind of what we're fighting against.
But you just triggered Moss. I can't remember her name.
Ann Moss?
Yeah, Ann Moss. Because you talked to her about the double-edged sword, and I think it's in order to succeed, we need to create something different that exists, but a version or a way that where we risk ourselves either getting hurt or but trying to change not only things for ourselves but for other people or the world. We're not only going against the one sword of what we're trying to do, but the double-edged sword of what how we're trying to change the power structure and deal with the overall world. And I think it's also, when did it become bad to not experience discomfort or apologize because you simply said or did something that was not that was incorrect,
right?
And it doesn't matter if it's Trump or other people, but somehow it's even in the world of social media, people don't necessarily want to apologize or be uncomfortable or
and they don't want to have it pointed out to them. That's where we get the whole idea about the PC police, the political correctness situation, and where I point out to you that you've said something that upsets me or is offensive to me, and somehow that makes I'm the problem,
right?
As opposed to you just saying, you know what, I never thought about it that way. I certainly didn't intend to hurt your feelings. I will consider that in my future behavior. It is not a complicated, situation. But for whatever reason...
And it goes back to power and control.
Right, And people who've never had their motives questioned before are now really pushing back at the idea that they can't just say whatever they want, whenever they want, about whomever they want without consequences.
Right. And there's been years and years of history, everything from the civil rights movement to the Vietnam War and other, where all that happens is that, and all that. So it's not something that's new where, we didn't realize there was a problem before. Right. This has always been a way of people starting movements and moving forward and changing things. People don't want it. The structure and the people in power don't want it to change because it works for them.
Right. Exactly.
But it's one of my friends came up with something: society rules versus house rules, where there are different standards, and it could be everything within school, within work, but there are different rules that you can apply to different situations, and how you act in your house is different than how you act in society.
Yes. And we teach that basic idea to the smallest of children, and so the idea that it's now that's something to argue against, or that there's conflict in that, to me is kind of baffling.
And I think the other piece of it too is that with all the stuff going around with social emotional learning and safety and security and risk management, everybody from 50 and above, they're like, well, we've never had to deal with that. We've never had to deal with that before, and well, you've had to deal with it. You've dealt with it in a different way.
You've responded to when something bad happens, as opposed to planning in advance.
Or you've suppressed it and said that some of these things didn't exist or didn't happen. And so, but people know now that as soon as there are certain triggers in the school system, for example, that if someone's exhibiting behavior, that there's a way to figure out what the problem is.
Right.
We were never given those tools before.
Right. We just said that's a bad kid, and then we treated them like they were a bad kid.
And it's but the bad kid was everybody from the Fonz to
right. Exactly.
He was a bad kid.
He was a bad kid. Right. And now we look at what is behavior trying to tell us about what that child needs,
right? Or what they're going through, how it's influencing their behavior, or what else is going on, and not only just what's going on in school or what's good.
Well, I could talk to you literally for a week, nonstop. So
I'll set up an appointment.
Phone
conversation.
That's right. Ongoing. Well, we're going to have lots of time coming up soon. So the Cerebral podcast is forthcoming. And once you get that up and running, I will push that out to the world and let them know that you have begun it. I think there's going to be a lot of people listening who are inspired and excited about a lot of what you've said today, and they're going to hear more from you. So is there anything else you want the world to know before we sign off?
No, I think we pretty much covered it, and as we've started, I wouldn't be the person that I am today without all of the influences, but you're one of my friends that I feel most emotionally connected to sometimes, because I think a lot of our shared experience, we have a lot of shared experience, even though we've grown up differently, been in different situations. So.
Well, I feel the same, and I'm very grateful that the universe and the Down Syndrome Association and that Real Abilities and the New Jersey Turnpike and 95 and all the things. One of the new thing that I have started saying recently is that the universe is a magnificent chess player. And we can have all the plans in the world. We can have all the thoughts about how we're going to control things, but in the end, there are thousands and thousands of things happening outside of our grasp and our understanding and our control, and we just have to be open to them when they happen to us. And that's one of the things that I think that you and I tend to understand, and I think it's what brought us together and